please feel free to come forward as well. My name is Sruti Bala. I'm a researcher at this faculty, Faculty of Humanities. I'm affiliated to the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis. I'm also a member of UvA Staff for Palestine collective, and will do my best to moderate this very important teach-in. This teach-in is being co-organized with UvA Staff for Palestine, Dutch Scholars for Palestine, and the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis. It is our collective contribution to mark Israeli Apartheid Week 2025. The matters we will address today are grave, they are urgent, they are of a magnitude that we will tragically struggle to fathom for many, many decades to come. I'm sure that, like me, many of you are here today or have taken the trouble to come at such short notice, hoping to find some answers to these profound and pressing issues. It's our hope to offer an academic community a language and a critical space to understand this history of our present. So the Israeli Apartheid Week, just a little bit of background, started in 2004. So it's a good long time ago, as an initiative of the Arab Students Collective in the University of Toronto. The original aim was to actually connect Palestine, intersectionally, if you like, to existing struggles at the time around deportation, indigenous rights, anti-racism, and the so-called war on terror. The idea behind the Israeli Apartheid Week is to stimulate public education initiatives on campuses around the world and raise awareness about apartheid in the Palestinian context, to understand the structural violence in Palestine, and to develop and disseminate strategies for collective liberation. So today's teaching is titled Epistemicide, Genocide, Apartheid, Our Ethical and Legal Obligations Towards Palestinians. The focus will be on the concept of epistemicide, and this comes from a combination of episteme, knowledge, science, and the Latin suffix "cide," meaning killing, and refers to the willful and systematic erasure, devaluation of knowledge systems of a people, and which serves as a mechanism of genocide, slavery, and settler colonialism. With our distinguished speakers, panelists, we will learn more about epistemicide in the context of Palestine, how it relates to genocide, apartheid, and settler colonial occupation. We will also examine what it teaches us about global politics and social justice today in contexts outside of Palestine as well. We will ask what it means for universities today as institutions of knowledge production, as well as sites of social and epistemological struggle, what responsibilities it bears for us. We'll focus on the one side on the legal obligations of universities, and on the other side on the ethical obligations in the face of epistemicide, genocide, and apartheid. So we have an excellent range of speakers. I will introduce each of them briefly as they start, but please join me in extending a warm welcome first to Lily George, Omar Barghouti, Pepijn Brandon, Kanad Bagchi, and Gamze Erdem Türkelli, who's joining us online from Belgium. And before I introduce them in detail, just a few practicalities. Each of the speakers will have approximately 15 minutes. We will have a break just before 7 o'clock to allow for those who are breaking their fast to do so, and Ramzan Mubarak to all who are observing. There will be some drinks and snacks offered by ASVA. And after around a 20-minute break, we will have time for an informal Q&A with the panel. The session is being recorded and will be placed on the YouTube channel of UvA Staff for Palestine later. We do have someone who will be, however, taking some pictures and recordings here for our social media purposes. There is no, it's perhaps almost, I hope it is unnecessary to say so, but there is no space here for discriminatory remarks of any kind. Please be kind to each other. These are very difficult issues. and topics, but let's be kind to each other in our disagreements and in the way we address each other. If these agreements are violated, you will be asked to leave. It's okay to feel uncomfortable. These are uncomfortable times. We are here to work through these discomforts together in the academic practice of in-depth knowledge building. Finally, I want to thank Yolande Jansen in particular for putting together this event at a very, very last minute, my colleague at ASVA. And I also want to acknowledge the support of the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis. We don't take the support for granted, as we know there are very few institutions at this moment who would be prepared to host an event marking Israeli Apartheid Week at the university. So with no further ado, I want to first invite our first speaker, Lily George. Lily was former chairperson of ASVA, the student union in Amsterdam, and has been actively involved in the student campaigns at this university. We start with you, Lily, not only because you cannot stay on till the end for practical reasons, but also because overall students have been teaching us so much over the past 18 months. So please tell us more about how students represented in ASVA see their own responsibility and the university's responsibilities toward Palestine, towards Palestinians, and how students see the responsibility of the university towards the students. So I will give you have a mic? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think one important thing to start with is that like ASVA is a representative of students, but it's a union, which means we have members. The students are our members. And quite quickly after the genocide had been going on for a long time, but when people started to admit the genocide was going on and the protests started happening, we had a vote at our general members meeting where the members actually voted to support both the demands of the encampments. Supported demands that we should that the university should break ties with the Israeli institutions, and also to organize against the genocide in Palestine. So, like this? Oh. Oh. Oh my God. Just a bit more. Go to the left, right, because it's the parkour. Do a backflip. So yes, our members voted that we saw it or as a responsibility as students and as a union to support these protests. Me, myself, and also a lot of like the ASVA members, we've also been present at the protest in May, but also at the protest in Science Park and in the Oudermanhuisport. So yeah, we see it as a responsibility because it's our university who has these ties, and in a way, it's our tuition money that is going there. So we are, without our consent, complicit in the genocide because we're funding it. We see it as a responsibility to stop that. What was the other question?
The question was what do you see is the responsibility of the university towards students?
Okay, well, I think one of the responsibilities is to not almost get your students killed at the eviction and not end them in the hospital. We quite failed to do that, sadly. But I think it's your responsibility as a university to be the example, like show like making the right moral choices, how to make these decisions, how to actually organize against these against these terrible things happening. Not like training in a demonstration or something. You can do that at ASVA, but more like how to stand up to these things and lead in a way. And I also think you have the responsibility to give room to both students and staff to organize and to discuss without all the violence they've been giving us right now.
Okay. Is there anything else you would like to share with us in relation to the topic of epistemicide and the place of the university? Or what you expect from the university in terms of your education around these questions?
Well, I expect my university to educate me about what is happening and not tell like propaganda and lies and tell half stories, etc. So I expect them to be honest to me both about what we are doing and what is happening in Palestine right now.
Okay.
And also to give staff the possibility to do that without like having to risk losing their jobs. So also create a safe environment for the teachers who want to teach us about these things to do that.
Okay.
I think the university should facilitate safety in the first place.
Okay, thank you very much, Lily. That was much shorter than I expected.
I'm sorry.
But I think you've made your point, straight away and straight to the center of the matters.
Yeah.
So feel free to also add anything if it comes to your mind at any point.
I think one thing I want to add is that I already said it like...
Hold it closer.
I said this also when we made the video half a year ago. I was part of a campaign where people said in the video, why are we doing this? Why are the protests happening? And I said it then, and I also say, we are like, at the university right now, we are winning. And it's never winning because there's the time, it's always too late, but we are winning, like we are breaking ties right now. So the staff is organizing strikes for this, like we can't lose. So the university is going to have to bend for us and not the other way around.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Lily. We'll move on to Professor Pepijn Brandon. Pepijn is Professor of Global Economic and Social History at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. He's a senior researcher also at the International Institute of Social History. Pepijn's work focuses on the history of capitalism, war, and economic development, and is one of the experts on slavery in the Dutch context. And the question that Pepijn offered to tackle with us is what Palestine teaches us about global politics and social justice today.
So first, let me say something about the students and salute the students for their actions, because I think we have to keep in mind that nothing moved at the university on this question before the students moved. So once again, thank you for taking that action, and you moved us forward because of it. So I do not want to make one of the key topics of this session obsolete, but I do think the ethical responsibility is clear. There's not much to debate here. And I want to start citing a passage from this very powerful text by Isabella Hamad, who gave a wonderful lecture, actually, about how Palestine is silenced in our culture and inside our universities just before the 7th of October. And this is from her afterwards that she wrote after the 7th of October, but before the last temporary ceasefire. She says, a past has been demolished. Universities, places of worship, writers, educators, journalists, little children, elderly people who remember the Nakba of 1948, and a future has been demolished. What future, you might ask? These people lived in a so-called open-air prison under siege for 17 years, their calorie intake counted by the Israeli state, their living conditions already uninhabitable. Yet there was a future there, and it has been destroyed. 2 million Palestinians have been displaced, and their mass murder is live-streamed. Those in Gaza who do not die from the bombs die of starvation, of thirst, or infectious diseases, or the cold. Hundreds more have been killed and tens of thousands subjected to settler and military terror in the West Bank. And the number of Palestinians in Israeli military prisons has doubled. It is simultaneously true that the Nakba of 1948 never really ended, and that we are currently watching it being repeated. An Israeli commander described the war on Gaza as Nakba 2.0. As I write this, a ceasefire has still not been called. I wonder what reality you now live in. From the point in time at which you read this, what do you say of the moment I am in? How large is the gulf between us? And with this gulf widening, another gulf is widening as well. There is seemingly unbridgeable gap between the moral anger of what I would say is the vast majority of our students, is a growing majority of our staff, and the complete inaction of those who formally represent us at the top of these of our institutions. So I want to speak a bit about that inaction, about what makes people not do the ethical thing to do, even when it's obvious. And I want to talk about three things. First, a willful, cultivated, and studied ignorance, masquerading as neutrality. Secondly, a lack of moral courage. And thirdly, where Palestine sits in the many crises that we are now confronting globally. And I want to unpack them a bit, one by one. So, on this willful ignorance, researchers of the University of Maryland and Washington University have just released a poll that they conducted among Middle East scholars throughout the West, but mostly in the United States. Scholars from all the major associations that have scholars on the Middle East. Hundreds responded, about a fifth of the entire body of scholars on the Middle East. So these are some of the responses. Do you feel the need of to self-censor when speaking about the Palestinian-Israeli issue in an academic or professional capacity? 76% of Middle Eastern scholars say yes, they feel the need to self-censor. They asked the 76%, what do you censor then? On which issue do you most feel you need to self-censor? Criticism of Palestinians was 11%. Criticism of Israel, 84%. Now there's many revealing and insightful questions and answers, but the one that I want to highlight here, the other one that I want to highlight, is how would you define Israel's military campaign in Gaza? Genocide, 46%. Major war crimes akin to genocide, 36%. Major war crimes but not akin to genocide, 9%. That makes 91% of the respondents, responding scholars saying these are major war crimes, with a vast majority saying they're major war crimes up to genocide or they're genocide, akin to genocide or genocide. But of course, none of the university boards that take decisions on cutting the ties or not cutting the ties with Israel consult their Middle East specialists. In fact, all sorts of people are interrogated on the policies and statements of universities. They're lawyers, they're public relations officers, they're outside pressure groups, they're politicians. But the university's own experts do not figure in this at all. It's not just Middle Eastern studies experts. It's genocide and Holocaust studies experts that, and many have noticed the crisis in genocide studies because the massive amount of genocide and Holocaust studies professors who say we need to act and are not being listened to. The argument always is that universities should remain neutral, but no one says that universities should remain neutral in the face of the expertise built on those universities, right? when truth clashes with vested interest, and we're seeing a massive clash between truth and vested interest, to side with vested interest is not neutrality. It's the pinnacle of bias. So that brings me to the second, lack of moral courage. And we have to talk about a lack of moral courage, not because the threat to universities is not real. I mean, we've seen Trump's action against Columbia University, right? After viciously repressing their own students and staff, viciously repressing, basically forcing them onto their knees. But everyone asked, why did they collapse so fast and so completely? So the attack is real. The attack is real in the Netherlands. And it's obviously an attack that is about Palestine, but it's also about more than Palestine. And the people doing those attacks tell us that it is about Palestine and it's about more than Palestine. That Palestine for them is the symbol of a rollback of what they describe as wokeness in universities. That is basically the forefront of the most severe attack on academic freedom since the McCarthy days in the United States. That what we've seen being rolled out here is a massive implementation of far-right cancel culture. Right? But not a cancel culture that exists of activists standing outside a hall with placards saying you're a racist. A cancel culture that consists of pinpointing oppositional voices and punishing them, threatening them with dismissal, threatening to go for the university's funding. An across-the-board show of naked power against academic freedom. So that is part of the question that we ask from university boards. Even if you are doubtful about Palestine, where are you in the face of this massive attack on academic freedom? An attack that is about Palestine, but that is about the complete denial of the identity of trans people, right? Not just in the US, but here. That is about the massive reversal of women's rights, not just in the US, but here. That's about the rollback of even the weakest forms of diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, things that we've criticized in the past because they were so soft, right? But even the weakest forms have to be abolished. And when Mahmoud Khalil was arrested in the US, the only thing I could think of was this, the famous Pater Niemöller verse, right? You've heard it a million times. First they came for the communists and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. That we are being cited, the first line of that verse, against us all the time, not as a warning as the verse was intended, but as a statement of fact. First they came for the Palestinians, first they came for the Palestine activists. I didn't say anything because I'm not a Palestinian. I'm not a Palestine activist. As a statement of fact. And there's this, I don't think that the majority of the people who make these choices are inherently bad people, but I think there is an intense lack of moral courage that comes with the warning, but taking a stance will cost us. Well, whoever told you that taking a stance for justice should be for free, right? Whoever told you that it doesn't cost? Yeah. To do the thing that's that is right. So, and that brings me to the final point, where Palestine sits in our whole cluster of crises. And here, I must say, one of the stupidest things, arguments that you hear all the time is this, but why are they so angry? Why are the people protesting this so angry? Why are the students so angry? Why they are so selective in their anger? Why just Israel? And it's stupid because it's so obvious that it's not just Israel. I was in the march last Saturday, the anti-racist march, and I was so happy to see the Palestinian flag and the kufiyya everywhere, right? Because showing this is a recognition that it is Palestine, and it's about everything that is connected to it. It is about a current order. Because the bombs do not only show that are currently falling, do not only show us this enormous disrespect, this enormous this genocidal rage against Palestinian lives. They also show us a future, and a future that is absolutely realistic. They show us the collapse of a post-1945 pretense that the lesson of the 20th century was that might doesn't make right. And that is now being replaced on the most brutal scale with the open acknowledgement that might makes right and dare to speak against it. And if we let Palestine slide, then we confirm day by day that this is the world that we'll live in. A world in which brute force is the prime mover. And let's be clear about this. Brutal force was the prime mover for people across the world throughout the 20th century, underneath this pretense. But it's the open acknowledgement and embrace of this that we're now seeing in front of our eyes in Palestine day by day. Where the fate of Gaza is not just something that is rolling over it, it's a libidinal desire by those in power. It's what they want to make happen. It's what they want to show us. And the kids who wear the keffiyeh say, we refuse to live in that world. We reject it. We reject it in total, and we reject it for the horrendous crime that's being committed against Palestinians. That is the ethical stance. And I agree with you. It is the stance that will prevail, however much it seems to be the opposite right now.
Thank you so much, Pepijn. That was, yeah, it makes me really want to swallow my, I have an extra mic here as well, but fine. Yeah, it really makes my mouth go dry, to be honest, what you said. But we come back to questions and discussion later. I'd like to move on now to Dr. Kanad Bagchi. Kanad is a postdoc in international law. I'm coming here so that Gamze can also see me on the screen. Kanad is a postdoc in international law at our university. Is a research fellow with the Decolonial Futures research priority area. So Kanad, as a legal scholar, you have studied the ICJ advisory opinion on apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territories. So maybe you could shed some light on this and the implications of this, since we are in doing this on Israeli Apartheid Week. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for turning up. So I'm going to talk to you about the ICJ advisory opinion that came out last year. Oh, okay. Oh, yes, of course. It's a little more. It's better now? Yeah, okay. All right. Okay. And I think that the advisory opinion that came out last year in July 2024 is perhaps one of the most profound decisions that have come out in the decades that have followed, and will perhaps be one of the most profound decisions that an international court, and in this case, the International Court of Justice, which we also refer to as the World Court, gives in the decades to come. And I really think the advisory opinion is and must be an essential read for everyone. And you don't quite really need to be a lawyer to be able to read that decision. It is rather clear. It expresses things that Palestinian activists, students, journalists have been saying for the last 60 to 70 years, right? So what I will do today is take you through some of the main highlights of the decision. It's a long decision. There's a lot that we can talk about it, and we must. But I'll take you through some of the highlights of the decision and particularly try and focus on the question of apartheid and what the court thought on the question of apartheid. But before I do that, it is important to understand that apartheid does not happen in a vacuum, right? But happens within an institutionalized system of discrimination, exclusion, and erasure. And in the case of the occupied Palestinian territories, the systematized regime of exclusion, erasure, and displacement has been the regime of occupation, right? And this is what the court had to deal with. So one of the central questions that the court had to deal with is, are you all right back there? So one of the central questions that the court had to deal with in this opinion, in this decision, was what are the consequences? And these words are important. What are the consequences of Israel's prolonged occupation, annexation, and discrimination in the occupied Palestinian territories, right? And I'll give you the answer right away. The court held that the entire regime of occupation is unlawful under international law. It's not just individual acts of killing and murder and discrimination and settlements and so on and so forth, but Israel's very presence in the territory itself is unlawful under international law. That's the main ruling that the court reached, right? And the court also clearly said that the occupation, because it's illegal, has to go. So when you hear a student chant outside that the occupation has to go, it's not merely an ethical or a moral sentiment that the student really expresses, it's an expression of the law, right? How did the court get to this? And that's where the decision becomes interesting. And be with me on this. I know that many of us are not lawyers. I will try and break it down as simply as possible. One important thing is to note about the decision is this, that the court was dealing with facts and circumstances that existed before 7th of October. So history did not begin on the 7th. So whatever the court has said and whatever I'm going to tell you has to do with Israel's occupation before October the 7th, right? That's one important thing to note. So what did the court say on occupation? It's important to understand that occupation under international law as such is neither legal or illegal. Occupation is a statement of fact. It exists. There is an occupied people, there is an occupier. There are certain rules under international law that makes an occupation illegal, right? What are those rules and what are those prohibitions? Primarily, there are three. That an occupation becomes illegal if it violates the prohibition of use of force, a prohibition that is mentioned under the UN Charter, a fundamental rule of international law, right? Occupation also becomes illegal if the nature of the occupation turns from being temporary to permanent, resulting in annexation. Annexation is illegal under international law. Occupation also becomes illegal if it violates the fundamental rule of self-determination. These are the three ways in which an occupation can become illegal, right? The court found 6 reasons. The court in its decision found 6 reasons why the occupation as such and its entirety is illegal. First, the court says that the occupation is illegal because the transfer of population from Israel and other parts of the world into the occupied Palestinian territories facilitated by Israel is illegal and unlawful. So the idea of settlements is unlawful. The court also points to the routine confiscation of land and property in the occupied Palestinian territory. The court points out that the routine exploitation of natural resources in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, and in West Bank by Israel for decades. And fourth, and this is perhaps the most important thing, the court found that Israel has substituted its own military law as opposed to the local law in the occupied Palestinian territory. So therefore, it has created a dual regime, dual legal regime, where on the one hand, Israeli settlers are subjected to civil law and civil courts. Non-settlers are subjected to military law and military courts, right? Fifth, that Israel has directly or indirectly facilitated the displacement of the population from the land. And lastly, the court found that there has been a systematic regime of violence and oppression that has been launched against the Palestinians, supported by an institutional system. These were the reasons given by the court to suggest that the occupation becomes a near situation of annexation. In the court's words, and I quote, there are so many things to quote in this decision. The court says that based on the totality of these facts, the occupation amounts to a de facto annexation, in the sense that it creates irreversible effects on the ground, right? So the question of discrimination, apartheid, and racial segregation comes in that backdrop. That's the history and that's the context within which we need to look at the question of apartheid. And that is what the court does. So apartheid comes towards the later part of the decision and also occupies, I think, if I'm not wrong, a substantial portion of the decision itself. Now, before this decision came out, we have also had several international human rights organizations, including the Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, BT Salem, and others who have confirmed apartheid in their reports, right? The court, unfortunately, does not cite any of these reports. What does the court cite instead? The court looks at the practice and documentation of UN human rights committees over the last 30 to 40 years, right? And there have been several reports by the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which has come out with detailed iterations of how segregation policies are put in place, right? The court finds essentially 3 main things in which there is a separate regime put in place for Palestinians and a separate regime put in place for Israeli settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories. The first thing the court looks into is the issue of residence permits in the occupied Palestinian territories. So if you are a non-Israeli Jew, then essentially you're a foreigner and you have to have a resident permit to stay in the occupied Palestinian territories, right? And these resident permits are not only difficult to get by, but are also revoked on absolutely ridiculous grounds. So for example, the court cites that one of the reasons your residence permit can be revoked is for breach of loyalty to Israel, for instance, right? There is also a separation policy, the court cites, whereby non-settlers in the West Bank are prohibited from residing in East Jerusalem, which means that if you have family residing in the West Bank, you're not able to see each other, right? So it has an effect on what the court says is reunification of families. The second thing the court looks into is on the system of restrictions on movement that Palestinians have to face on an everyday basis. The regime of checkpoints that we know all about, the impediments created by the wall, which was put across the West Bank, restrictions that were put with respect to worship, and all of these measures were targeted towards Palestinians as a group, and that is what makes these discriminatory measures unlawful. And the third thing that the court pointed out is the problem of demolition of property. Repeatedly, we have heard houses being demolished in the occupied Palestinian territory for both punitive reasons as well as for lack of building permits. Now, unfortunately, getting a building permit for a Palestinian in the occupied Palestinian territory is almost impossible. The court cites reports from the UN, from the UN report saying that about 90% of building permits are rejected when it's a Palestinian who wants to set up a building. So in the light of all of this, the court says, and this is where things get slightly tricky, court says that the actions and policies of Israel are in violation of Article 3 of the Third Convention. The Third Convention is the Convention on Prohibition of Racial Discrimination and its elimination. And Article 3 says, and I'm quoting here, state parties particularly condemn racial segregation and apartheid and undertake to prevent, prohibit, and eradicate all practices of this nature in territories under their jurisdiction. The court says that Israel's legislation and measures impose and serve to maintain a near complete separation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem between the settler and the Palestinian communities, and therefore, these policies and practices are in violation of Article 3 of the Third Convention. It stops there, right? There has been a lot of scholarship and literature that has come out after that, where many people have said, well, you know, the court has definitely made a reference to Article 3 of the Third Convention, but it has not specified whether or not Israel is committing apartheid. Okay, fine. But you read the 20 pages that the court wrote before that, right? And the way it catalogued the systemic nature of the discrimination that happens, the court uses the word systemic. We have also read countless other reports that the court has cited in view of the fact of how this complete near separation between the West Bank and East Jerusalem is maintained and continued through domination and oppression. And if we understand apartheid, the definition of apartheid, and I'm coming to that, under the Apartheid Convention as this, and I quote, practices of racial segregation and discrimination committed for the purposes of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group over others and systematically oppressing them. If that's the definition under the law, then it's hard to argue that the systemic nature of Israelis' presence in the occupied Palestinian territories make it anything but a situation of apartheid. Many will tell you that that's not what the court said. I beg to differ. What is the most interesting, and I'll stop at this because I know my time is up, is what the court said about what kind of consequences come out of this. And I think that's important because I think the court did not leave a single stone unturned in terms of what it said. right? And I'll read out to you what it means. So the court said that Israel is in violation, of course, of the CERT Convention, racial segregation and apartheid. Its occupation is illegal. Its occupation is legal because of the use of force, because of annexation, because of it prohibits the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. So what are the consequences for Israel? First, the court says, end the occupation as rapidly as possible. Second, the court says, Israel has to seize all new settlements. No more new settlements. Third, the court says that Israel has to repeal its own legislations. Right? Repeal its own legislations which maintains the unlawful nature of that occupation. Fourth, and this is important, the court asks Israel for full reparation to Palestine. Right? And what does that include? Okay, full reparation, great. What does that include? Obligation to return land and other immovable property. Assets seized from any natural or legal persons since 1967, including cultural property, archives, and documents. Dismantling parts of the wall that fall into the occupied Palestinian territories. And most importantly, allowing all Palestinians displaced during the occupation to return to their original place of residence. That's how far the court went. And in fact, if you follow the court's logic and its conclusion, this is exactly what you will reach at. That there has been a breach of a peremptory norm of international law, as fundamental as that of self-determination, as fundamental as that of occupation. So the only thing that you can do and must do under international law is reparations, and reparations have to be full reparations. Anyway, I think I'll stop at that for now, but I'm happy to take more questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kanad, for also very lucidly kind of breaking down some of those points from the ICJ advisory opinion. Many of us are, struggling to figure out the legalities of this. And here it seems, I mean, to a lay person's mind, it feels like they're stating what has been said by so many for so long already. But the legal, the legal kind of framing of this by this court of this standing, the highest international court, is really significant. We move on. I would like to introduce now a speaker who's joining us from Antwerp, Professor Gamze Erdem Türkelli. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Gamze, and taking time to join us online. Professor Erdem Türkelli is Associate Research Professor at the Law and Development Research Group at the University of Antwerp. We reached out to her because you were one of the co-authors of a legal brief, much discussed legal brief on the breaches of obligations arising from peremptory norms of general international law and consequences for institutional cooperation with universities in Israel. Together with Talia Kruger and Kundefeiter. So we'd really love to hear more from you about the arguments in this legal brief. And if you have any observations on what you think would be relevant to the Dutch university context. Thank you so much, Gamze.
Thank you, Sruti. And thank you so much for inviting me and including me in this important teach-in. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person, although you're all very close by. I had to be in Belgium both tomorrow morning, but late into the evening tonight. And yes, indeed, I will try to present the legal brief we co-wrote with my colleagues, but just to let you know of the sad fact that Professor Kundefeiter, who was the chair of international law at the University of Antwerp, suddenly passed away about 2.5 weeks after we had finished this legal brief. So I will try to do justice to his scholarship, but also present his parts of our common work as accurately and as respectfully as possible. And indeed, I think I will pick up on a point that Kanad really expertly sort of put in front of us, and that's the question of the so-called jus cogens in Latin, but in English, peremptory norms of international law. And we wrote this legal brief just on the heels of the advisory opinion, because as legal scholars, we thought that this legal opinion of this advisory opinion, this legal setting of facts and the framing of it, of those facts in the law was so important coming out of the World Court that we needed to dissect all the obligations that were pronounced, underscored, and just made bare for the international community as such, and for our universities, what those consequences would be. So we thought this was really important. And so I'll try to very briefly explain, because I know that you have a very multidisciplinary audience and not too many legal scholars or legal students of law in your audience. But peremptory norms of international law, they are recognized as the international community as norms that are of the highest order. They're so fundamental that there is no lawful derogation possible. So they bind all states, but I would argue all actors of society, even without ascribing to a treaty, signing a contract, without any exceptions and without any reservations. And these include the prohibition of genocide, the prohibition of crimes against humanity, of racial discrimination and apartheid, as well as the respect for the right to self-determination and the respect for the basic rules of international humanitarian law. And as Kanad has also explained, many of these peremptory norms of international law have been violated in the context of the occupied Palestinian territories. And these obligations, they give rise to, these peremptory norms give rise to obligations that bind everyone. And no country could say, well, I'm defending myself, or someone has attacked me, I'm taking countermeasures, I'm in distress, I have a force majeure to breach those norms. So these are absolute norms. And so in addition to the advisory opinion, where the International Court of Justice found that a number of such norms, including the very basic tenets of humanitarian law, the respect for self-determination of the Palestinian people, but also the prohibition of racial discrimination and apartheid. So these norms were being violated by the illegality of Israel's occupation. But of course, as you all know, that's not the only case or the only the only case before the ICJ. There are a number of genocide cases linked to the situation in Gaza. And unfortunately, now we're seeing how important it is to follow through with those procedures, with the newest round of escalation. And the International Court of Justice in the South Africa versus Israel case found that the Palestinians in Gaza were a significant part of the protected group of Palestinians, and their intentional destruction would have an impact on the group of Palestinians as a whole. And so their right to be protected from acts of genocide and related prohibited acts were plausible. It actually meant, given that the court ordered more and more stringent provisional measures, that actually there was an exacerbating risk of genocide that the court recognized against the Palestinian population in Gaza. And the Genocide Convention also brings about these obligations that bind everyone. So it's not just Israel that is a state party to the convention, but also being challenged in the court with allegations of genocide, but it's also the entire international community that has obligations. And the provisional measures that have been ordered also create obligations for every other state in the world, which means that the measures taken by third states to ensure and induce compliance with the provisional measures and with the Genocide Convention can become more stringent and more comprehensive over time. And I will maybe go into also something that the ICJ advisory opinion underscored, that the violations by Israel of the peremptory norms of international law that were enumerated by the court have consequences for other states. The court explicitly said that all states must cooperate with the United Nations to end Israel's illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory and to ensure that the Palestinian people attain the right to self-determination. All states must abstain from relations or dealings with Israel that recognize its illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territories. They may not aid in recognizing this illegal presence in any manner. They must refrain from providing support, whether that be material, logistical, military, or economic, that can be used in the commission of such violations, or that can be used also to legalize the violations by normalizing their context. Again, all states must take effective measures to respond to violations of these highest order norms, including diplomatic measures, targeted economic measures, and other sanctions. And to summarize, the International Court of Justice, both in its recent advisory opinion, which I believe is one of the landmark legal opinions that it's ever entered, as well as its provisional measures orders in the genocide case, have actually, the court has made clear that this is a context that's distinguished at hand. This context at hand is distinguished from other contexts where we have, of course, human rights violations occurring, but these violations are of such a widespread, severe, and prolonged nature that they require us to take action, all states to take action. And so we, as scholars of international law, then went on to look at what these consequences would be for our universities as actors that are organs of society that have a responsibility to teach, to educate, to do research. And if no state can violate these highest order norms, and no state can be complicit, should be complicit, we believe that this obligation trickles down to universities as organs of society with a special mandate to educate, to do research. And we argue that universities, and we looked at our university, which is a public university in Belgium, but also private universities, there's an argument to be made that they should also do no harm and not be complicit. And so we argue that our university, but other universities also must avoid aiding and assisting in the commission of serious breaches of peremptory norms of international law created by Israel's illegal presence and address that such aid and assistance when it occurs. And public universities, of course, there can be an argument made that they are organs of society, organs of the state under international law. It means that when universities would actually be implicated in violations of international law, that the state may be held responsible. But it also means that the obligations that the Belgian state has would apply to public universities as well. Even if the state in question doesn't take direct measures, we still are bound by the obligation to not be involved in commissions of international law violations. And that doesn't mean that universities do not have independence or that individual academics don't have academic freedom. That's not in dispute, but it's about the institutional setting and the institutions following international law and abiding by its most fundamental and highest order norms. And we make that argument because there is ample evidence that Israeli institutions are embedded in the exclusivist nature of the Israeli political system and do benefit from, but also have rendered their support to this prolonged illegal occupation. And so I'm not going to go into the context of those that involvement, but given that these institutions operate within a legal and political context that entails and has for a very, very long time entailed violations of these peremptory norms of international law, this presents an extremely high risk of complicity and may amount to aid and assistance in maintaining the situation, the illegal situation created by Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. Until such a time as all of these violations are brought to an end, universities, we argue, have a duty to act within a very strict due diligence framework, departing from a precautionary principle in assessing the risk of complicity in these grave violations and other breaches of international humanitarian and international human rights law. And so we argue that first, the university, our university and other universities ought to ensure full compliance with the obligations of their states under international law, international human rights law, and humanitarian law, as well as the obligations under Belgian domestic law, which include not to recognize as legal the situation, this unlawful situation, not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation, in legitimizing the situation, to, as it follows, to end collaborations with academic and other institutions that are directly or indirectly implicated in the violations of international law in the occupied Palestinian territories, including in Gaza, but more generally in the occupied Palestinian territories, depart from the precautionary principle and not initiate any new collaborations until such a time as violations are brought to an end, and also to put on an agenda and discuss, especially in terms of these bigger consortia where research is being done by multiple institutions, especially relevant for European Union funding, to examine the correct ways to terminate the participation of Israeli institutions and communicate the issue to the funder. And my late colleague, Professor De Fater, and I'll conclude with this, was very adamant on this point, but that we thought the single exception to this rule would be putting together a credible form of carefully negotiated inter-university cooperation that has the specific aim of bringing to an end the unlawful situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, including these norms that were being violated. So unless the collaboration specifically had an objective of putting an end to those violations, bringing an end to the unlawful occupation of Palestine, that we thought no further new collaborations ought to be established, but also existing collaborations should cease to be implemented, given the extremely high risk of complicity in these severe violations of peremptory norms of international law. And I'll stop there.
Very useful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for clearly, coming down to the issue of how it sort of trickles down to universities, as you called it. And I found really important here in the context of our discussion on epistemicide that this is related to the mandate of the university towards knowledge production, towards researching and teaching. It's a duty both towards the task of the university as well as duty in terms of holding states accountable. Okay, I would like to move straight on to our next final speaker before we then take a short break. And this is Omar Barghouti. Thank you, Omar, for being here and welcome. Omar is a co-founder of the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, and is also a colleague here at our university, is PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of Amsterdam. So Omar, please do take us through to the question of bring this back to the question of epistemicide and the ethical obligations of ending complicity in occupation, apartheid and genocide.
Thank you very much, Sruti, and everyone for this panel, which is really illuminating. Referring to Palestinians in the illegally occupied Gaza Strip, Israeli former Chief of Staff, former War Minister Moshe Ya'alon, himself accused of numerous war crimes and crimes against humanity during his term, has recently accused the Israeli government of sending the army to Gaza to commit ethnic cleansing and, quote, kill them all, end of quote. Saying the quiet part out loud, he said, quote, I expect the state of Israel not to send soldiers to kill babies and women, end of quote. Israel's ongoing genocide, according to UN human rights experts, has included, quote, domicide, herbicide, scholasticide, medicide, cultural genocide, and more recently, ecocide, end of quote. A survey published late last year by human rights organizations highlights the severe psychological toll of the genocide on Palestinian children in particular. It found that 96% of Palestinian children in Gaza felt that death was imminent. In January, referring to Palestinian children in Gaza, the UN humanitarian chief Tom Fletcher told the UN Security Council that, quote, children have been killed, starved, and frozen to death. Some died before their first breath, perishing with their mothers in childbirth, end of quote. The UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel, earlier this month, published a report about Israel's systematic use of sexual, reproductive, and other forms of gender-based violence since 7 October 2023. It documented the sharp increase in the use of, quote, rape and other forms of sexual violence by Israeli soldiers and settlers against Palestinians to, quote, dominate, oppress, and destroy the Palestinian people in whole or in part, end of quote. The report added, quote, Israel's use of starvation as a method of war, the denial of humanitarian assistance, and the concerted policy to destroy Gaza's healthcare system, compounded by the lack of water and access to sanitation facilities, caused severe reproductive harms to women and girls, impacting all aspects of reproduction, end of quote. The Commission concluded that the Israeli authorities have destroyed, in part, the reproductive capacity of the Palestinians in Gaza as a group, including by imposing measures intended to prevent births, one of the categories of genocidal acts in the Rome Statute and Genocide Convention, end of quote. So Israel's physical erasure of indigenous Palestinians, including children, is actually as old as Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine. It's not new. In a particularly shocking testimony of an Israeli soldier published in a mainstream Israeli newspaper, Davar, in 1979, for instance, he described what his fellow Israeli soldiers did in the Palestinian village of Al-Dawayima during the 1948 Nakba. He said, quote, to kill the children, they fractured their heads with sticks. The men and women of the villages were pushed into houses without food or water. Then the soldiers came to dynamite the houses. One commander ordered a soldier to bring 2 women into a house he was about to blow up. Another soldier prided himself upon having raped an Arab woman before shooting her to death. Another Arab woman with her newborn baby was made to clean the place for a couple of days, and then they shot her and the baby. Educated and well-mannered commanders, he said, who were considered good guys, became base murderers. And this not in the storm of battle, but as a method of expulsion and extermination. The fewer the Arabs who remain, the better. End of quote. Fast forward to 2008, when an Israeli Labor Party leader threatened Palestinians with a bigger Holocaust if resistance groups did not stop their armed retaliation to Israel's siege and violent attacks on Gaza. A day after Israel's latest massacre last week, which killed in a few hours over 400 Palestinians, including 130 children, mostly while sleeping, War Minister Yisrael Katz directly addressed the 2.3 million Palestinian survivors of the US-Israeli genocide, saying, quote, Gaza residents, this is a final warning, end of quote. Echoing language from 1930s Germany, Katz issued an ultimatum, quote, accept Trump's plan or face total destruction and ruin. But what gives Israel, a relatively small settler colony, this level of utter impunity that allows it to perpetrate the world's first live-streamed genocide? One of the most important factors that can explain this lies in the fact that Israel has obsessively used the word iron in naming its military operations and military systems. The current brutal aggression in the West Bank, for example, is termed Iron Wall, which refers to the title of a booklet published in 1923 by Jabotinsky, a very prominent Zionist leader. In that booklet, Jabotinsky honestly wrote, quote, "Zionist colonization must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population, which means that it can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall which the native population cannot breach." End of quote. Jabotinsky's Iron Wall, a pillar of Zionist settler colonialism, has always included brute colonization of the land and a simultaneous attempted colonization of the minds of indigenous Palestinians with dread and despair, which would in turn facilitate stripping us not only of our cultural identity, but also of our human attributes as well. Here's where epistemicide becomes a critical weapon in the genocidal arsenal of colonizers. Epistemicide entails not just the erasure and or appropriation of a people's knowledge system, but also the simultaneous obstruction of knowledge about the people and its struggle against oppression. The latter part is often missing in analyses of the more visible forms of Western complicity in Israel's genocide and its underlying decades-old regime of settler colonial apartheid, such as arming, funding, shielding from accountability to international law, etc. The pervasive and perverse complicity of the colonial West and the genealogy of Israel's depiction and treatment of Palestinians in Gaza as human animals can be traced to the centuries-old history of European and Euro-American dehumanization and colonial subjugation, even extermination, of non-European nations. The Western hegemonic establishment, including governments, corporations, universities, the mainstream media, etc., is not only actively enabling Israel's genocide, in parallel, it's also desperately and harshly trying to silence all advocacy of Palestinian rights, to deprive us of our collective agency, of our ability to articulate, to resist, and to stop the genocide. In partnership with Western colonial powers, Israel's ontological and epistemic erasure of Palestinians, as in similar settler colonial contexts, is inextricably interwoven and symbiotic with the initially gradual, but now accelerated, physical elimination that Palestinians have been subjected to since the 1948 Nakba of ethnic cleansing. Epistemic erasure always makes physical elimination more acceptable and less contestable, as oppressors cannot be blamed for eliminating something that did not really exist in the first place, or whose mere existence did not constitute sufficient subjectivity. This form of epistemicide is a crucial part of genocide. In this context, the new McCarthyism that Pepijn spoke about, we're witnessing in the US and Germany, most brutally, but also across the West, is premised on deep-seated anti-Palestinian racism and must be seen as an indispensable part of Israel's ongoing epistemicide. In August 2024, for example, the Hollywood publication Vrije published a letter authored by over 65 Palestinian filmmakers criticizing the Western-dominated film industry for decades of, quote, erasure, racism, and censorship, propagating a stereotypical, dehumanizing image of Palestinians as worthless, disposable beings, end of quote. This entrenched image, the letter argue, has enabled, quote, the whitewashing and or justification of the crimes perpetrated for decades against Palestinians, end of quote, as well as the current ongoing genocide. In mainstream Western political parties, media outlets, cultural institutions, universities, among others, Israel's genocidal propaganda since October 23 has in fact found a receptive establishment, a fertile ground for dehumanizing Palestinians to justify and rationalize the AI-powered machine of industrial extermination in Gaza. 5 centuries of colonialism, slavery, and subjugation of non-European nations have left their racist and dehumanizing print on the cultural DNA of the West. On the other hand, the millions in the West who have fought this complicity with inspiring courage, especially on campuses, have faced smears, vilification, intimidation, repression. They realize that the struggles for racial, indigenous, economic, social, gender, and climate justice worldwide are intersectionally connected with the struggle for Palestinian liberation. They also recognize by now that Israel, in partnership with the EU and the US, is not just destroying tens of thousands of Palestinian lives, but also the very foundations of international law, ushering in a might makes right era, as Pepijn said, unseen in many decades and posing a serious threat to millions worldwide. Trumpism is only the most naked and emblematic manifestation of this era. Israel's regime of oppression is a model for much of the world's authoritarian rulers. It's a partner of fascist parties in the West, including in this country, most of whom are anti-Semitic to the core. And it's a partner of far-right regimes, exporting its colonial doctrines as battle-tested, its weapons, its spyware, its election rigging services as diplomacy tool, and so on and so forth. Another factor animating the solidarity movement, despite the repression, is the realization that the most profound ethical obligation, especially in times of extreme repression and oppression, is to do no harm and to stop and repair harm done in your name. Palestinians are not begging the world for charity. We're calling for meaningful solidarity. But before both, we're demanding an end to complicity, to do no harm. Ending complicity in grave human rights violations is a matter of duty, not discretion. As the struggle that abolished apartheid in South Africa has shown, ending state, corporate, and institutional complicity in Israel's atrocity crimes, especially through the non-violent tactics of BDS, is the most effective form of solidarity. In the words of Craig Mokhaybar, a former senior UN human rights official, the ICJ ruling makes BDS, quote, not only a moral imperative and constitutional and human right, but also an international legal obligation, end of quote. Based on this complicity of the Dutch state, institutions, corporations in Israel's epistemicide, genocide, and apartheid, and given that your quasi-democracy still allows for meaningful protest, Palestinians are calling on you to, 1, build a critical mass of intersectional people power to end this multifaceted Dutch complicity, to comply with the ICJ rulings, in fact. Military embargo, ending the EU-Israel Association Agreement, banning products and services of companies illegally involved in Israel's occupation. 2, offset the complicity that is beyond your control by actively engaging in meaningful, impactful solidarity, especially the nonviolent form of BDS. In a university, this means cutting academic ties with complicit Israeli universities and financial ties with complicit corporations. 3, and last, throughout, fight racism and dehumanization in all forms, among others, by rejecting the unethical colonial timeline of violence, which sets the clock to when resistance to oppression starts, rather than with the initiation of oppression, the root cause of violence. A second point here is fighting repression and centering representative Palestinian voices, and then bypassing the dehumanizing lens of most mainstream media outlets by seeking the truth from alternative media sources and Palestinians on the ground. To conclude, some may complain about genocide fatigue and losing hope after all these months of genocide. As British Pakistani writer Nadim Aslam says, quote, despair has to be earned. I personally have not done all I can to change things. I haven't yet earned the right to despair, end of quote. For a century, the Palestinian people has been resisting oppression, massacres, ethnic cleansing, starvation, mass incarceration, destruction of homes and farms, apartheid, and now genocide. We have never given up. We insist on our full menu of rights. We strive to thrive in our homeland in freedom, justice, equality, and unmitigated dignity. Do not fall into complacency until you end Dutch complicity in Israel's crimes. Do not give up hope. You have not earned it yet. Thank you.